was wondering if the panelists could now talk about what, if any, barriers to diversity and inclusion you've encountered or observed during your careers in legal education, and how did you address or overcome them? Rosa, why don't you get us started?
So I think this is a great question because I think the question about diversity is asked, in a lot of different ways. But to frame it this way in terms of barriers, I think is a really good one, especially in these times. So when I first started teaching, I actually noticed an obvious barrier, which was that I did feel like I was getting challenged by certain students. And I mean, generally, I would put them in the white male category, just as a general statement. And I think also part of it was, that I think people often think I'm a little bit younger than I am. So it was a matter of like a younger female Asian professor. And it's probably somewhat unconscious too, but it was really kind of disconcerting, because you want to, obviously everybody, understands you want to be composed, you want to be authoritative, and, you want to be a good teacher, but it's hard to do when you feel like you are being challenged. And as a new teacher, I think it's not always clear how to navigate that because you don't want to be defensive, you don't want to call people out and make other people feel uncomfortable. So that I would say that was a challenge in the very beginning when I started teaching as an adjunct, actually. And part of it had to do with my comfort level. So for folks who are just starting teaching, it's good to know that the more sort of confidence you build as a teacher, the more easily or the more sort of painlessly you can navigate the trouble student or the students that like to challenge professors. And I think this does happen more with female professors and maybe sometimes younger or younger seeming, because I certainly wasn't really that young at the time even. But so that's maybe the first sort of barrier actually to teaching that I noticed. But then, as you do get more sort of seasoned and comfortable and even more sort of understanding of where students are coming from, that they would even have that sort of instinct or disposition, and maybe, try to connect with them on different levels where you're giving them a more a sense of confidence in you. I think just to turn it into an advantage and a strength. I mean, I'm always sort of thinking about um, how these sort of attributes that may seem like barriers or weaknesses can really be turned into strengths. And so, thinking about that, it sort of then I started to, with this question, started to think about what this means for our field. What are the barriers for our field? And as you probably know, we have the least diverse teaching demographic out of the three sort of podium, clinical, and legal writing professors. I mean, the numbers are pretty poor generally, but they are the worst for the legal writing community. And there are many reasons for that, because historically, our status was not one that would be one that we would encourage students from traditionally underrepresented communities to happily join, because there are so many challenges that you would face along the way. But I started to get more involved in sort of ways that we can encourage this, because I really think it's important for the faculty who have really the most sort of hands-on, face-time, interactive relationship with our students to be well represented and to be as diverse as our students are. So I think it's even more important for legal writing faculty to be represented and to be diverse. So I think there are just different ways to do that. I mean, I think you can encourage this on an institutional level for hiring practices. You can do it within the legal writing community, AALS. try to bring people together to talk about this issue and to be sort of inclusive, not just of legal writing faculty, but other sort of skills-focused faculty, because I think there's not a lot of attention paid, like within the LWI and Allwood. I think we all have a very good understanding of this issue, or most of us do. But within AALS, there isn't always a connection between the minority faculty and the legal writing faculty. And a lot of times the conversation about legal writing faculty gets lost in the minority faculty conversation. So I wanted to try to bridge that gap somewhat, and that's a work in progress, and we're still working on that. Anyway, I think I've gone on too long, but just I'll end with one point, which I think is, I mean, I always think about this, you know, when you enter any law school and you see the portraits or the photos on the walls, how important it is for those images to reflect the students that are there. So, I mean, I think about this, and I think that the biggest sort of benefit, if you will, to not being a majority person is that I'm modeling the ability to teach law to other students. It's just by my sheer existence and you know, doing what I do, that I think in some ways I can have the biggest impact. So I think about that a lot. Well, you know, just when I think about my students every year, if I do have any students of color in my students, you know, I think about that being maybe a small benefit to them, that they're seeing somebody who may look like them and not like most of the portraits on the wall, you know, stand in the front of the room and teach them. So that's a very long answer, but it's such a loaded question too, right?
I actually have read, you know, a lot of works written by faculty members of color about this because of course it relates to the status issue. And the status is a barrier to racial diversity in legal writing and to gender diversity in legal writing. I always say it's very hard when I think about recruiting people of color into legal writing. It's like, hey, how'd you like to experience discrimination in a whole new way? Because that's what it boils down to in a lot of schools, that it is, oh, you're teaching in a weird way, you're teaching in a different way, you're different. Many of you are probably familiar with Lori Benai from Seattle, who wrote a great article called Challenged ×3. And Rosa, as you alluded to, certainly I've talked to many faculty of color who were specifically told, don't go into legal writing. And so that hurts legal writing, and the low status tends to mean men don't come to legal writing or are not hired in legal writing because of the various implicit and explicit biases. So we have a lot of white women and we have a few other groups. And I think that hurts legal writing in so many ways because it's just like, oh, different. That's a different group. Look, this is, you know, look at the teachers in this field. They're different than the teachers in the other fields. And as Rosa indicates, it's absolutely as important to have a variety of role models in front of the classroom in legal writing as it is in any other field, especially when, you know, not everybody will be doing contracts or torts, but everybody will be doing legal writing, no matter their career. I think about when I'm so old that when I started teaching, I used to still get letters addressed, "Dear Sir," because women were not anywhere near equal numbers on the faculty. I remember when I started at Ohio State, one of the assistant deans used to have what she called the lady lawyer's lunch. Every woman who was a lawyer in the building, no matter her status, was invited, and we could sit at a table, at one table. And Rosa indicated the issue of faculty of color have issues, and then the issues of legal writing faculty or legal writing faculty of color can get lost. I think the same thing is true of women faculty one of the things I've written about is that I thought that women faculty would be the biggest champions for legal writing faculty, because they would see, oh, these are our sisters suffering here. And Rosa's shaking her head, because that absolutely has not been the case. And my theory on that, and I'm sure others have made this observation, I don't think I'm unique here, and I think it's also true for faculty of color, I don't think women feel secure at their place in the academy. I think that many of them don't feel that they have the political capital to spend on anyone else. They are just feel like, you know, whether correctly or incorrectly, they feel like they are just hanging on. So in talking about this, this is one of the reasons we have to keep fighting for equal treatment, because without equal treatment, we are getting a misrepresentation of society in the faculty positions in legal writing. We are not getting the reality of who teaches in every other field. Wow, that was really inarticulate. That we're not getting a representative group. And I'll tell you, one time when I was, I think, president of Allwood or incoming president of Allwood, it was when the minority or people of color group in AALS was started, and they were having a meeting. And so I attended the meeting. And I expected it was going to be about status. And I was ready to get in there and talk about status and all of this. And they wanted to talk about what are the issues that our students of color face in legal writing. And it was just like, first I felt like an idiot, and then it just reinforced to me how important it is to have diversity in front of the classroom, because people of various perspectives are going to bring that perspective into the teaching. And especially in our field where we share so much nationally, the more people there are scattered around the country, even the more we get these issues into all our classrooms, and the more knowledge we're able to share. The other thing I will just echo some of the things Rosa said about sort of, I don't know if this is what you're referring to implicitly, Rosa, but the credibility issue. That students, I think that, you know, studies have shown that white males, you know, I think there's a thing, is there a book or something called Presumed Incompetent, and that the typical standard white male is presumed competent. I remember when my dad turned about 75 or 80, and I said, Dad, the days when you were presumed competent are over. Now people are going to look at you and see old man, whereas before they looked at you and it saw person. And so I think, you know, one of the things, anyone who's coming into practice, coming from practice into legal writing, I've told my adjuncts, you know, drop your clerkship experience into conversation. Drop your, you know, well, I worked on a case once where blah, 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 blah. I know so many writing faculty who have worked on big cases and all of this, and then they have one who'll say, well, you know, here's what really should happen in our case. And the professor's like, yeah. So make sure your students know, here's the experience I come from. Here's, you know, I'm not just, you know, I've got my academic experience, my knowledge, the articles I've read, the research I've done, and here's my professional experience. I've seen these kinds of cases over and over again. I've dealt with opposing counsel, all of this. Let me say, I almost never practice, so I can't do any of that. I'm very envious of you all who can. I always say I'm the equivalent of a male gynecologist. I got my knowledge through study and observation rather than direct experience. But in thinking about talking to our students, and I know those of you who have dealt with these issues probably know this term, but I think it's one that's relevant for legal writing faculty. There's a concept called disconfirming evidence. So what bias do our students bring to us based on our status as a teacher, based on the course we're teaching, based on our gender, our orientation? And so they might think, well, she can't teach me because, now I'm almost at she can't teach me because she's old. But what do they do? And so how can I provide disconfirming evidence? Or that this class, this is just like an English class I took in college. Why do I have to take this class? That's why I start out saying heuristics before I say formula. When I talk about my self-graded draft exercise, to my legal writing friends, I call it my highlighting exercise. To my students, I start out calling it my metacognitive exercise. Now, both terms are accurate. I absolutely admit I'm trying to get across to my students, there is substance in this course. This is not your mother's high school English course or your high school English course. We're at a different level now. I'm trying to think, there was something else I was going to say. Yeah. It's just, I'm just going to say it's a big problem. We've got bias against our field. We've got bias against the people who teach it. And that bias, it's a vicious circle. That bias makes the jobs less attractive, which makes it harder to attract a diverse population to teach it. We have incredible, great teachers. And this is the thing, if our faculty were so weak and so bad, they wouldn't keep getting recruited into administrative jobs. Think of, we now are having more and more legal writing associate deans and legal writing deans. And it's because they know, we know how law students are, we know how to teach, we know the realities of law school. So change is coming, but not fast enough.
Hey Beth, before we move to Jason, I want to ask a quick follow-up, because this is something that I think a lot of the listeners and viewers will have a question about, which is, as a new professor, first-year professor, how can you effectively balance establishing your legitimacy in the classroom by, for example, talking about your experience, with being approachable and inaccessible? And there are some gender dynamics in that too. There's research that shows that the reception of that sort of what some would call self-promotion, I don't think of it that way, but it is received differently depending on the speaker. So I'm wondering if you could just speak really briefly to that question, because I know that's something that a lot of new faculty struggle to do effectively.
Absolutely, I think it can be a problem, again, especially for women. I think probably the three women on this panel, and maybe Jason, you've had it too, have had the experience of having our clothing commented on in our course evaluations. And so thinking about, I'm sending a message with the dress, the way I dress, I'm sending a message with my vocabulary. I actually would say probably to err on the side of hard ass at the beginning of the semester, because if you err on the side of hard ass, you can soften up later. If you start out too soft, it's very hard to become more difficult later. But I do think that it's, you know, I was saying the answer to another question that teaching is about love. When I started doing live critiques, the first time I did them, the next time I met my students, they all looked at me like, we thought you liked us and now we know you hate us. And so I literally had to say, and because I'm an old lady, I can get away with saying it just this way. I said, I still love you all, you know, and one of the things that I think, as if I were a young teacher starting out today, I might really think about talking to students about professionalism, you know, and sort of code switching, which is, now in some classes, I act like a judge. In some classes, I act like a professor. And, you know, you are going to have professional relationships that are more casual, and you're going to have professional relationships that are more formal. And I might say in class, I expect, you know, I know there's only one law school that I know where they still make people stand when they talk. But in class, I expect this behavior and this behavior and this behavior. Now, when we're in my office for conference, I'm going to be, you know, I'm going to pass out cookies, and I'm going to, you know, we're going to have a lot more casual. But I just want you to know, as going in, here are the expectations for class, and here are the expectations for outside of class. One of the things that is so hard about the remote teaching is I don't get those opportunities to say hello in the hallway and how's it going, and, you know, seeing them in all these different contexts. And so I guess, and this boils down to what Rosa was saying in answer to another question, is transparency. So I think being transparent with your students about what expectations you have for your professional relationship and your personal relationship, and letting them know. And my sister, who is a high school teacher, she and I have talked about this. She tells her students, even if you flunk my class, that's not going to have an impact on our personal relationship. Okay, so just getting that across to them, that these are two separate things. I love you, but I still have high demands. And that's tough to communicate, but I think it's important.
Thank you, that's great. Jason, can you tell us about any barriers to diversity and inclusion you've encountered or observed?
Sure. So let me start off. The first thing I want to say, I want to follow up just on your question. I think this picks up a little bit on what Mary Beth was just saying. When I was at an Allwood, it was the Allwood conference in Memphis, I believe, and Emily Grant did a presentation, and I think then she wrote an article also about 4 types of law professors, right? And the ones that is the motherly kind of, or fatherly, very nice, makes you happy, gives you treats, and then at the end it was a grid. And the 4th one was like the, really strict, get the work done, but reinforce you with positive comments when you get the work done, and which one students want. And you think they would want the take care of you, grandmotherly, grandfatherly, happy, and they don't. They want the hard ass. And it was a really interesting presentation, and I wish I could remember the name of the article, but it's Emily Grant, and I encourage people to look for that article because I think it really goes to what Mary Beth was just talking about in terms of how you present and how you come across in the classroom. The other thing I wanted to follow up also that Mary Beth said was this idea of credibility. And I want, as the white man on the panel, which puts me actually in the minority in legal writing, which is an odd situation. Not to mention the fact that I also have a gay white man, but the idea of credibility also among your colleagues, which is really ties into this, where the inclusion diversity comes. When I was interviewing and I knew I wanted to be a legal writing professor, I had been an adjunct, I love working with the 1Ls, this was my passion. When I started interviewing, during one of my initial interviews, I had 2 faculty members who started the interview, it was my first interview with them, asked me their very first question, why do you want to join the pink ghetto? And I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. And I had to think for a second. And my first reaction was, I didn't say I was gay, but are they talking about me being gay? What does this pink ghetto mean? I don't know what this means. Are they making some kind of slur about my sexual orientation? And so I had to really think about how I was going to address this. And so in the space of the 15 seconds while I'm sitting there, I finally just said to him, I absolutely have no idea what you're talking about. I said, I don't know what that term means, and I don't know what you're referring to. He goes, well, legal writing, because it's an all-woman field. Why would you want to be a legal writing professor in an all-female field? And it was like, I went, whoa, right? How do you even begin? And of course, they were 2 senior male professors who also were both African-American. So it was a really interesting dynamic, right? To have that happen in one of my first interviews in the field. And I answered the question. So then I just answered the question and told them why I was passionate about legal writing, why I wanted to be a legal writing professor. But it really made me realize, even from the get-go, as a person, a white male who seems to have privilege, right? I was already put in a box in terms of what it meant to be legal writing. And I started, and we can talk about status also, but I started as a contract professor. I was hired on a 1-year contract my first year at Stetson, which then the following year was moved to programmatic tenure. And I was on programmatic tenure and got programmatic tenure at Stetson, which was then moved to unitary tenure, and I applied and got unitary tenure. So I've kind of walked through the various stages. And one of the really important things I think for that in terms of the inclusive part, right? And I'll talk this from the perspective of being the colleague, is demonstrating that you are, and it's going to sound a little weird, but you are worthy, right? You know what you're talking about. You are an expert in your field. You can write, you can teach, you can do service, you can be, as Mary Beth said, we are now administrators, we are now deans. So that idea of, unfortunately, and this is a little odd to say when we're talking about diversity, but making us look like them, right, is really, really important in terms of, so it's also this idea of that not being a threat, right? This idea that we do it and that it works and that we can. And so I think so that was my experience, right? And this was my experience for inclusion as a white male. But that presents all sorts of challenges for me, for my students also, because my students don't differentiate me necessarily from any other professor who is a white male professor, right? So I am just like the torts professor or the contracts professor or whereas my experiences have been somewhat different. So it leads to some really interesting conversations. And I do a cultural competency project in class where we talk about, I put up different pictures and I ask them to write 3 words on on a card, self-describing themselves. And I do it myself also. And I'll start by saying something like white professor, father. And I have them all do. And then we go around and I say, well, how many of you put, poor or blind or widowed or, and it really leads us to this conversation of all different types of, there's so much more diversity and inclusion than what we see on the surface. So I think there's anyway, so I think that's some of the ways I overcome the stereotype of the white male, but also where I feel like trying to have that inclusion as a legal writing professor.
Thank you, Jason. That's a really nice segue into the next question, which is really about whether you incorporate discussions about diversity and inclusion into your legal writing classroom. So I would love to hear more about those types of exercises like the one that you just mentioned that you're doing, or just discussions that you have. How about, Rosa, do you want to get us started with that one?
Sure. So I've always been a little bit conflicted about this issue, honestly. As a department, we've talked about having, integrating more of issues that bring up some of these topics in the problems that we do in common. We develop some on our own, and we usually start off with one common closed memo problem. And then we have these long conversations about how to do that well. What ethnicity, what gender identity, and it's a good conversation, but I think my hesitation until recently is I don't want to, first of all, I don't want to kind of get it wrong. And what I mean by that is, I know what it feels like when other people get it wrong, when it deals with something that relates to my identity. And it could be really well intentioned, but it just isn't coming across in a positive way. So I really hesitate to do that to any of my students. So I guess I'm a little bit more careful in that regard. But also I have then concerns about my students, getting off track in terms of, what are the learning outcomes I'm trying to accomplish in this course. And so, I mean, those have been my concerns really until recently. And things have changed, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is that institutionally, Suffolk has been talking a lot about actually requiring faculty as much as you can without stamping on their academic freedom, but requiring faculty to integrate issues related to race and diversity in other manners into their curriculum. And so, I mean, the way that I think makes the most sense in a legal writing course is to include issues that sort of arise organically in the problem, right? Who are these people? What is the dispute? What questions does it raise legitimately? And not something that is kind of a one-off, let's today talk about, the underlying tensions having to do with race, but that it happens sort of organically as part of the problem solving that happens around a legal writing problem. So I still think that's kind of the best way to do it. But one other thing that I've sort of been thinking about recently, because it is so much at the fore of everyone's sort of thoughts and discourse just in the country and in law schools everywhere now, is that I also feel like I need to become better educated, frankly. I mean, I feel like I know the problems with my identity really well, obviously, but I can't speak with fluency about other people's experiences, nor would I be expected to. But I think you have to have some awareness before you can, even have a conversation about it with your students. So I've actually done the diversity committee at my school has actually invited us to do this. I don't know, have you guys done or heard of the 21-day racial equity habit building challenge? It's by the ABA. Are you involved in that, Jason? It's by the ABA's labor and law section.
Yeah, I haven't. I have it on my computer. I've got it like I saved the web page so I can go back to it because I just haven't had time to really
So
delve into
actually a really good way to do this, and our diversity committee was smart to do it. I mean, we would get an email every day saying, this is the homework for today. And it's really important to do it in these small spurts because it's overwhelming, because there is so much out there and there's a lot of great stuff and some stuff maybe that isn't as great. So it's sort of curated. And by and large, I've really liked the selections, and they're either short little podcasts or articles. Some articles are a little bit longer, but the homework isn't overly burdensome. And so I just finished my 21 days, and I actually feel like I have a better understanding and grasp of some of the nuances and some of the issues that that really just were not on my radar. Even sort of, I'm thinking, well, I'm a pretty aware person, but I hadn't quite thought of things a certain way. And I'll give you just one example of this one piece that just is about white privilege. And it's about, like, the author is literally forcing herself to make a list of all of the ways in which she experiences white privilege, all the things you don't have to worry about on a given day. You know, how you got your job, or people making assumptions about you when you walk into your room, you know, people clutching their purses when you know, this kind of thing, what you don't have to experience when you have it. And I feel like as an Asian American, I sort of can relate both ways. I have a lot of privilege, but I also understand the looks, you know, or whatever, the questions that people have, or assuming that I am a certain way because, you know, I'm Asian. And so it was a great exercise. So I would highly recommend that. So my point was really that I think that it's good to become more aware and educated. The more you decide to incorporate issues that are going to, you know, generate some difficult conversations, or, you know, maybe not difficult, but certainly you want to be inclusive. You want to understand what, you know, your students kind of as best as you can. It's not going to be perfect. I don't expect, you know, the fall semester to be perfect, and we're using a problem that really does include some issues. Actually, on the gender identity issue, we've chosen to use a problem along those lines. And so I really want to become a little bit more aware. So anyway, I will leave my answer there, but I think it is really important. I think the students are going to expect us as law professors not to avoid these topics, and I think it's incumbent on us to you know, to satisfy that. But I think there are good ways to do it, and maybe, you know, not so great ways. It's tricky. It's definitely tricky. I'll leave it there.
I agree with so much of what Rosa said about fear of blowing it. And, you know, I think what a lot of us feel is, I don't want to make it worse. You know, if we don't talk about it, then we don't, you know, no one's going to say something really horrible, and I'm not going to react in the wrong way and all of that. So I do think there's a lot of fear. I will say the Alwood conference in Minnesota a few years ago, where we all had the implicit bias speakers and all of that, that was a great learning experience for me. I, probably like a lot of people, have a Black Lives Matter reading list that I'm working my way through this summer. And the White Fragility book is on it. One of my daughters, who works in a park, said the thing that she loved about it was that it will give me a lot of vocabulary, so that when students react in a certain way, or if they do, but probably when they do, I can say, well, you know what you're experiencing here, blah, blah, blah. And I know I read a New Yorker article about the white fragility concept, and I was like, oh yeah, I felt that. I think also, and this was a point Rosa made in answer to another question, or no, it was a point that I made, one of us, the concept of humility, that letting the students know, but Rosa said transparency. I'm going to be transparent about how humble I am. Just getting across to them that I don't know all the answers. I'm still working through this. And actually, one of the, when it comes to gender identity, I had a lot of conversations last year about the use of they and non-binary pronouns. And I said, right now I wouldn't recommend, but I said my advice may be different next week. You know, I said always use the pronoun that a person asks you to use for that person, but as far as generically for singular, you know, and I'm actually amending my concept because I know we have singular and plural you. And so I'm confident we can adjust to singular and plural they. And I actually, for judges, I'm going to be teaching, I have a whole set of slides on that concept. The other, a couple other things, you know, we teach standard use of language. And one of the things that I used in my advanced course, I used the Joe Williams book, Style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace. And he has a really great discussion early in the book about how that is a power concept. You know, some language use is about clarity. I don't understand what you're saying. And that's not the way we talk here. If you say up street, walk I, nobody understands that. But if you say ain't, we all understand it. We've just decided as a society, we're going to look down on that. And so I talk to students again about code switching and that, and I say in my comments, I'm not going to worry about correct grammar. And don't worry, I'm sure we've all gotten emails from students where they say, don't correct my grammar in my email, you know, and I letting them know, yeah, this is like an outfit we put on. And it is about power, and it was a way for, it's a way for the elites to distinguish themselves from non-elites, is all this grammar stuff. And so, like probably many of you, I talk about, here's stuff that you always care about, here's stuff you only care about in a document to a court, here's stuff that you just tell people they're being jerks. The other thing, as far as sort of the more substantive issues, I know I've done for the past couple of years a problem that I was so excited when I discovered it in the problem idea bank, which is newbies, if you don't know about that, find out about it, about what if you had an all-female taxi service, and would that be okay under Title VII? And the answer, of course, is duh, no. But what's so fabulous is I play the client and the students ask me the questions, and you see all the women in the room going, oh, that would be great. You know, because pretty much every woman has been harassed or annoyed by an Uber driver, or a cab driver, or whatever. And ironically, one semester I was teaching this and I broke my wrist. I was alone and I drove myself to the hospital with a broken wrist, and I got driven home by a male cab driver at 3 a.m. So it was, it was fun. He was fine. But I read this somewhere, and it led to just one day we just had a discussion about, it's a great thing because it's, the thing I love about that problem is it's Me Too meets not all men. And so we just had a discussion in class, and I laid ground rules, and I'm not always good about laying ground rules. One of the ground rules I laid was, before you start your comment, you have to acknowledge the person who went before you or someone else's comment. And my goal there is to prevent people from being like, my turn next, and not listening to each other. And also, and I said to, I talked about the concept of amplifying voices. Some of you may know that vocabulary term. The women in the Obama administration found themselves facing that very common problem of other people mouthing their ideas. Like, wait a minute, didn't I just say that? And so whenever a woman would put forth an idea, the other women would amplify it. They would repeat it. Well, they would say, well, Rosa makes a very good point. Or even, I disagree with Rosa's point. Rosa's suggesting this, but I disagree with it. And so I told the students, you don't have to agree with it, but you need to acknowledge it. And I said to the men students, I said, if you want to make a friend of the women that you work with, acknowledge their ideas in meetings and you will be a great friend. But I asked one question, and I think this coming semester, because I'm planning to use it again, I might ask 2 questions. And the one question I asked, again, not my idea, I asked everyone to write down, what do you do on a daily basis? What steps you take, what decisions you make, what behaviors you engage in to avoid being sexually assaulted? And as you might imagine, the men were like, and the women started writing, carry my keys, park here, you know, don't go out after dark alone, all this stuff. And so it was just like this moment for the men a lot of them to realize, which I think a lot of them, me too, my husband among them, yeah, I knew this went on, but I didn't know how constantly it was on your mind to avoiding this. And I think, and I don't know that I've settled on the perfect question, so maybe this 21-day exercise will help me. I think I might also try to ask a question like, what steps do you take on a daily basis to avoid having someone call the police on you? You know, what steps do you take to avoid encounters with the police? And again, I think for me, old white lady, you know, I don't punch police officers because that's about what it would take. There's no one that people are less afraid of than someone in my demographic. But I think obviously for our students of color, and especially for our Black male students, they would have a long list. You know, I never leave a store without a receipt. You know, whenever I approach a stranger, I always make sure my hands are out. You know, I think they would have a lot of things. And just getting people to think about the daily lives of each other. And I don't know if to avoid white fragility, if I also have to think of a question that will involve white men, like what do you do to make sure people don't think you're racist? Because unfortunately, this is what a lot of white fragility is. We're very afraid of someone thinking we're racist. And yeah, I don't want people to think I'm racist, but I don't think that's as bad as being assaulted or being afraid of police. So I guess the bottom line in this is I'm still learning. And I think we all still are.
Thank you, Mary Beth. That's so interesting. And I think it adds this other concept of diversity and inclusion, but also privilege. I think some of the exercises you were alluding to are really kind of self-examining privilege in different contexts. I think it's really interesting. You guys are giving such amazing ideas. Jason, what about you?
So I try to work in a lot of things during the course of the semester in terms of the problems I hand out, you know, and I tend to push the envelope a little bit anyway. I teach the second semester when I teach persuasive writing. We have focus groups or focus sections at Stetson the students can elect into. We let our students in the first year elect. So we have one on environmental law, we have one on elder law, we have one on First Amendment law, and then I teach someone on international law. So it's international law and domestic courts, and all my problems have that spin on it. Well, consequently, my problems, by the very nature of something with international law, lets me do things like Convention Against Torture or like immigration and asylums, right? So there's the problem I just did actually was the asylum problem and torture, and my character is, you know, I switched around. This time it happened to be a gay man who was being, you know, abused in his country because of his sexual orientation. So it leads to, you know, them having to read things, to read cases, and to understand just by the nature of the problem. So I think it has to be organic in some respects. If you try to, you know, if I just try to make, you know, I'm just going to put, you know, and I think Rosa said this, you know, a Black gay man in my problem without any context, it doesn't really, it just looks forced. So I think the subject matter, to the extent it allows me to do that, is helpful. So that's kind of, and I don't tend to talk a lot about in class unless it comes up, right? And it will come up just because of the nature of talking about the cases or the problems, and then I let the conversation evolve. I've gotten better at that over time. Like everything else, the more you do it, the more comfortable you can be with it. Although I will say, and this goes to Rosa's point about, you know, what happened, being concerned about getting it wrong, and sometimes you get it wrong without even realize you're going to get it wrong, and that's okay, right? And the idea is, and I'll tell you what happened. I use a problem. I've been using the same problem for 15 years of teaching, right? But as an adjunct, I used it when I was now teaching at Stetson. I've been using it, and it's a problem about building a rule. And the rule is a trespass rule. It's a real, you know, and I give them these really silly fact scenarios to help build the trespass rule. And it's Mrs. McGinty on her front porch with her garden hose, and different people come onto the property or not on the property, either accidentally or because they're being chased by hornets. But the problem, and it was written by a friend of mine a long time ago, and like I said, I've been using it, you know, he used it and I've been using it forever. But it's set in East Ukraine or Ukraine, and Mrs. McGinty, you know, the characters like are Skeeter and Parson, and like, and you know, and one of the girls calls her a Jezebel because, you know, she took her prize-winning pigs and wrapped them in her blanket, and you know, and it's silly, right? It's supposed to be really silly. But I had a student who came up to me after class, really upset. She goes, "Can I speak to you?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "I just want to let you know that what we did in class today really upset, because I have everyone read them. We kind of build the rule together." She said, "It was really upsetting." She goes, "I'm from Appalachia, and I've worked really, really hard to get rid of my accent, to get rid of the stereotype. And this problem brought up all these things for me. And I know you weren't trying to, and I understood the point of the assignment. It's a great assignment for building a rule, and I totally get it. But you could do the same assignment without doing the characters, without doing the language." And I said, "Thank you very much for coming up to speak to me. That took a lot of courage. I really respect the fact that you came and spoke to me. I really appreciate it. And I will revise the problem," right? And so but it never really, until I had that conversation, right? There was a point where I was teaching a lesson using something silly to get the point across. And, but it really affected her. And the best I could do was apologize, recognize that this was, you know, my privilege, right? Of not growing up in that environment and not understanding how it might hurt somebody, and changing it.
I'm going to interrupt here just to praise you, and to say something that I think would be a natural reaction for many of us, and that you did not do, which is, "Well, I didn't mean it, so it's okay," you know, or to say, "Well, you shouldn't feel that way because I think you're great." And I really praise you for taking the criticism and saying, "I will change it," and thank you. And this gets to the fragility issue. And when we get criticized, and we will get criticized, to listen to the reality behind it and to try not to put up our defensive wall right away. Yeah. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
it's true. And my first reaction, of course, was, right, as soon as she came up, she started challenging the problem. I thought, oh, she's going to challenge what's going on, right? And I could feel as a professor, right, who does this student think she is, challenging the professor about his teaching method? But, you know, as she got into it, and she was really upset. I mean, I could see I had visibly, you know, and it was very hard, not even so much in class, but having to come talk to me afterwards. And I gave her, I mean, it really was. And this was in the fall. So we had been in class, 4 or 5 weeks. So we hadn't really established those relationships yet. She did. So it was a learning lesson for me, right? As lifelong learners, it was important for me to see that, and really made me think about what I'm doing in class and how I could get so focused in the lesson I'm trying to teach that I miss what may be underneath some of the undercurrents.
So I'd like to turn to questions of tenure and promotion. What advice would you give to somebody who is planning to go up for promotion or tenure soon, or is currently navigating the tenure and promotion process at that person's school? Let's start with Rosa.
All right. So I actually want to kind of be very brass tacks about this question, because I think people really want very specific things, just information. And so I would first say it's great that you have the opportunity to go for tenure. Not everybody does. And that raises a whole other conversation we can have about that and status and things like that. But if you are in that process, the very first thing, and this may be really basic, but really understand what the standards are. What are the tenure standards at your institution? Scholarship, service, teaching. Will people be observing you? How many? What's the scholarship requirement? What kind of scholarship counts? Service. Just really understand it so that you know exactly what others will be looking at when they are evaluating your application. Let's take each of those in turn. Teaching. At least at my school, there is actually a list of standards. So you have to match, or you have to meet teaching excellence standards. So what are they? How are they determined? Classroom observations will happen. and take those very seriously. Communicate with the person who is actually going to be observing you. Provide them with materials in advance. Show some initiative. I mean, these are obviously sort of commonsensical, and I think many in our field are really on top of things like this. But I think these things do make a difference. As far as scholarship, again, if there is like a junior faculty scholarship group or committee, um, um, be active, get involved, have people know your work. If you can do a junior workshop of sorts, that's very helpful, because not only will it give you the experience of having to present your scholarship, but also you are just becoming known as a scholar at your institution, which I think is sometimes really important for legal writing faculty, who are not often perceived as scholars by many. In fact, there are probably many, folks who were surprised that that was even a part of the work that legal writing faculty are doing. So I think that's important. As far as service, the third pillar, I think here, it's you can always just get too involved and spread yourself really thin. I mean, my advice always is to be sort of selective and make an impact as much as you can, even if it means you have to put a little bit more work into the role that you're playing on that particular committee project. So, for example, when I was doing, on the teaching committee, I volunteered to help rewrite our course evaluations. And that's a lot of work, but it sort of, you have something to take away at the end of that experience, even though you put a lot of time and effort into it. And it's something that obviously can stand out in your annual report or your resume as you put your activities together. I think generally having internal allies and support, as well as external allies and support. Both of those, I think, are really important. I think internally, it's not always easy to share everything, as you all know, with the people that you work with, especially when it comes to things like scholarship, where you may just be a little bit less, you may be a little bit more inhibited within that forum. I think some people feel that way. But I think having some support and having, strong allies internally is important. If some of those allies can be folks of influence, that's even better. But obviously you can't always control that. I think having, and externally, our community is so great for creating these opportunities to do workshops, and obviously for teaching ideas. I mean, I think this is really where our strength lies in the level of activity and resources and engagement we do around teaching and scholarship and service too, but especially on the teaching and scholarship. Take advantage. It's really a safe space, right, to do a scholarship workshop. And there's so many opportunities to do it. I still remember my first going to a regional conference and doing and workshopping my article, and it was a really great and supportive experience. And so I think all of these resources are there, but I think it's important to kind of line up all of the pieces that you need to have, know what they are, and start working on lining those up and be strategic so that you're not sort of necessarily, spreading yourself thin or spending time on things that really aren't going to translate as well, or frankly, to contribute as much to your institution. So those are my tips.
Reluctant as I am to share my opinion, I will make an exception this time. First of all, endorse everything Rosa has said and the additions you made. I absolutely would read those rules like you're reading a statute, okay? And I would also find two other kinds of rules, which are your local rules and your unwritten rules. See if there are any rules that are particular to your status. Sometimes that happens. They might be in a different part of the faculty rules. They might be in a different document. So don't just rely on your own research. As you indicated, talk to somebody. I would try to find out who has been on the promotion and tenure committee over the last few years. And I would try to talk to one of those people, see if one of those people is in your orbit. Talk to the legal writing faculty and see if there's someone they would recommend. Ideally, they would be one of the people, but that won't always be the situation. I'll give you an example of a local rule that I faced at Ohio State. And it was not a bad rule in any way, but you had to have 6 people review your scholarship. And the rule was if you, the candidate, recommended one of them, that person had an asterisk, and so their comments were not as significant. But the unwritten rule was that you could figure out a way to get the names. So you could tell your mentor, okay, give them this name and this name and this name. I remember I wanted to get Darby Dickerson's name to the committee, and they were just about to start making phone calls. And so I just brought up a conversation about Darby Dickerson, and I literally kind of went to the chair of the promotion committee, and he was like, okay, this has been a great conversation, Mary Beth, which is so stupid that it had to be that way, but that was the unwritten rule, so that's what I did. But I mean, but one of the things I found out, which I wish I'd known when I was writing my articles, was the first place they went to find people to review your scholarship was your citations. So think about, first of all, we should of course always be citing relevant people and doing a literature review, in which case those good names would come up. But think about down the line, is there someone who I would like to just get in that committee's head? The other thing I wish I had done, I had a major controversy when I went up for tenure about whether my works were really scholarship. One of them was an article called Better Writing, Better Thinking, and it was about using legal writing teaching techniques in what I called the casebook classroom. The other one was my appellate advocacy textbook. And I was horrified, and my mentor, Debbie Merritt, the great Debbie Merritt, was horrified. Looking back, and I still remember the chair of the committee, who was a super duper scholar, you know, one like he would sneeze and there would be an article, sneezing in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, he was just like this incredibly prolific scholar. And he told me that he didn't think there was controversy on the committee that my article, that my book rather, was scholarship. And fortunately, I had recently read the rules, and I said, well, John, I have to disagree with you, because the rules specifically say that they should be articles or works that include affecting legal institutions. And certainly appellate courts are a legal institution. And so this book is meant to help lawyers affect appellate courts and their decisions. And so I would say, look for phrases that pay in those rules. Be able to articulate how your teaching, your scholarship, your service meet those phrases that pay. And if you don't know phrase that pays, it's just my funny word for key terms. So if it says that your work has to either influence or affect or analyze a legal institution, then here's how my work does that. You will absolutely find, unfortunately, that at some schools they don't want you writing about legal writing. And I know the beautiful irony is that when I went up for promotion, what I've called my white whale article, my ballot design article, I had someone say that it wasn't about legal writing and I should really be writing in my field. And I explained to him that it was about document design, which is absolutely one of the core pieces about legal writing. So I would, first find out what are the standards. And this relates to what Rosa was talking about, get internal mentors. I think it's very important to get people's advice within the building, because then they feel more invested, and try to ask them advice that you can take, so that they think, oh, Mary Beth is very wise. She took my advice and put this section of our article, like if there's something I want to decide whether to do A or B, can you help me? And then do what they say, and then you can thank them in your footnote, and they feel I'm invested in Mary Beth, so I'm going to be one of the people talking in her favor in the meeting. As far as teaching goes, I'm going to be a little Machiavellian here. I would look for phrases that pay in your teaching evaluations. And so if it says, did the teacher make you think critically about this, I would find opportunities to use those phrases that pay. Gang, what we're trying to do here is think critically about how legal writing makes a difference. So import those things in. Something I used to do when this is a joke, this is hyperbole, but I joke that I used to get evaluations that said, die bitch, when my students really hated me. No one ever said that. They did someone one time say, fire her. I was teaching the entire first year class with adjuncts. I used to develop a twitch by the end of every semester. It was a horrible, horrible time in my career. But one thing I did that helped my course evaluations, the day they did the course evaluations, before they did them, we created this document that was essentially what I learned this semester. And as we reviewed it in class, it was group work, and we did the phases of the writing process. And I said, this is your cheat sheet that you can take with you next semester or this summer or whatever it is. And then I would praise them accurately, not BS. I would praise them for what they had learned. I was like, look at all you've learned this semester. This is so great. If you can manipulate, and if you can write your own course evaluations, which I did then, but you don't always do it. The first question on the evaluation was, do you believe you learned the fundamentals of legal writing this semester? Don't say basics, say fundamentals. And almost everybody said yes. If I'm a dean reading that, I don't even need to read beyond that question. So think about what do I want them writing in my course evaluations? Can I honestly, and in ways that promote teaching, instead of using my own words, can I use words that when they read the course evaluation, they're going to say, oh yeah, we did talk about that exact thing. Blah, 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 blah. The other thing is when you have someone review your work, your teaching, I feel like we do so much teaching outside the classroom. And so if you do live critiques, you might say, could you come and observe one of my live critiques? One time, I used to type up my evaluations and print them out in the days before email, and I accidentally printed out 2 sets of my comments. So I gave 1 set to the guy, one of the people observing me teach, and he was a friend. So I said, so Steve, this is, these are comments on student papers, and so I'm giving to you. Can I just say, if you think you can say something positive, you can feel free to comment, but if you don't think you can say something positive, you can feel free to throw them away. And part of his review of my teaching was, in addition to her classroom work, Professor Beazley does extensive teaching through her commenting. And he was able to articulate specific things that he did. As far as the service goes, it was so funny, Rosa. I was, of course, making notes while you were talking. And as you were saying, be selective, I was writing down be selective. Because you've got to think about, do I want a line on a resume? What's this going to look like on my CV? Or do I need FaceTime? Do I need to appear at certain events? Are certain events very important? There are some deans who take attendance at significant events. And Abby, you were talking about remembering all the stuff you do. I never knew, because I was a staff member for many years at Ohio State before I was even allowed on the faculty. And I saw a friend of mine's CV. I was like, oh my God, I haven't been putting any of this stuff in. If you walk down the hall with someone, you should see, should I put this on my CV? Counseling session, blah, blah, blah. But what I did was I started keeping what I call an ego file. Every time I got a thank you note, I would put it in the days when my evaluation said fire her. I was like, okay. But then it evolved. Every time I did something, I would print out, and I'm sure you can do it electronically now, but I would print out the reminder about it and stick it in my file, because by the end of the year when you're writing stuff up, you forget what you do because you do so much. And if I did a case briefing session, there were signs around the building, I would tear one of those down and stick it in my ego file, because it's as amazing as it may seem. I know there are things that I did a Clio thing for like 3 or 4 years in a row. It's never been on my CV because I forgot, and it seems silly to add it now. And I can't even be sure what summers they were that I did it. So make sure you record every little thing you do, because you can always decide later not to put it in. One more thing I'm going to say about the CV, and that is use your organizational and document design skills. I see so many CVs that are just this line after line after line. This was purely born out of my ego. I was lucky enough to be president of LWI sometime in the 20th century. And it was something I was super proud of. And I had all my service just in one clump, and it got lower and lower on my CV. So I created categories in my CV: leadership, scholarship, and in service, leadership, editorial work, so think about, and I'm sure a lot of people only looked at the heading and maybe one line underneath the heading. So think about, what things do I want to draw attention to on my CV? Can I categorize the work I did before law school? Can I categorize my service? Do I have a lot of little articles that maybe they're thinking, well, gee, these, like, I was worried that they would think I was taking credit for things that weren't scholarships. So I have law reviews, I have journals and, newsletters and magazines. Think about, how do I categorize this so I make it as easy as possible for the person who's reviewing this to absorb the things I want them to absorb. And the last thing, and this picks up on what Rosa said, I'm guessing all of us, and we can all nod, is it okay if someone contacts us to ask advice? Yeah, and I would say pretty much everybody in legal writing, we are just, we are all in this lifeboat together, folks. So feel free to contact us and think about, there are mentoring committees in both Howard and LWI. Contact them and say, here's my problem, who should I talk to? And I bet they'll give you a good direction there and a good email and phone number. So good luck.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. That was great. And I'll just say, we do have the new member outreach committee for LWI. I co-chair it with Catherine Page, and we are happy to help put you in touch with mentors, with any of the panelists today, and also help to address any questions that you have. And we usually will have events at lots of the local workshops and all of the major conferences as well. So we've done mentoring sessions and outreach happy hours and other events as well. So be on the lookout for some of those opportunities. Jason, other additional thoughts on the tenure and promotion process that you have?
So these comments are so helpful, and so I agree with everything. I endorse everything that's being said, and I've made my own notes about document design on my CV because I'm about to go back and redesign my CV. So thank you. Just a couple of quick points, and I think this goes back to an original comment about expectations and knowing your own school's expectations and understanding the terminology at your school, which is really important, because I was, as I mentioned, I was hired on a one-year contract, and then at the end of my first year, we switched over to programmatic tenure. So we had all these new rules about what programmatic tenure meant and what we're gonna have to do for programmatic tenure that no one knew because we were all guinea pigs. So I decided to investigate and try to figure out what I had to do for tenure. So I wound up going, it was the year after that, I was at AALS, and there was a panel presentation, something about tenure, how to put your tenure path, how to get ready for tenure or something. And I went, and the panelists are all talking about putting together your tenure file and having your tenure file and, pulling, as Mary Beth said, pulling all the things together and keeping it in a folder and having your scholarship, and right. And they're talking about creating these gigantic notebooks. And I am now panic stricken because I am 2 years into this process and I do not have a tenure file. I do not have a notebook. I do not have a folder with any kind of email in it. So I get back to Stetson and I go to one of my colleagues who was one of my mentors, and I said, oh my God, this tenure file thing, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do? I don't have this. And I was really, he's like, calm down. He said, you don't need it. That's not how we work here, right? Your tenure report will be 4 or 5 pages long with whatever materials we put in it, but we do very short tenure reports, right? Some schools have, and I've done now tenure reviews where I've gotten a notebook from the school that has scholarship, service, right? Stetson, on the other hand, sends out your articles. One of the people on the committee sends out the articles with a letter. Someone else is reviewing your service, which you put together your list of service, and then someone comes in and evaluates your teaching. You pull all your teaching evaluations, but we don't create notebooks at Stetson, right? So it's important to know. So I calmed down. I figured, okay, I still have a chance at this tenure thing. I haven't blown it 2 years in. But again, so it means different things at different places potentially, right? So really understand the culture of your university, your school, to understand what you really have to put together. And you don't know, talk to people, right? I ask the question because it's important you find that out. In light of that, also know what, and I think both Mary Beth and Rosa mentioned this, but know what the expectations are with scholarship. And by that also, not only what type of scholarship you do, is legal writing considered scholarship, which unfortunately it always should be, and some faculty clearly won't think it is. My first article I wrote was on mass claims processes, where I came from. I had done a lot of international mass claims tribunals, and so a colleague at GW and I wrote an article together. It was the first article we had started before I even joined the Stetson, but it got published when we were at Stetson. It wound up being published at the Journal of International Law, Berkeley University Journal of International Law, which is one of the preeminent international law journals, the second one. One of the first questions I got from one of my colleagues was, well, for your first article, why did you choose to do a co-authored piece? Right? And the article is 85 pages long. I wrote sections of it. He wrote sections of it. We could clearly delineate which sections which based on our own backgrounds and our own experiences. But that was the first question I got, right? Why? So, and we were able to answer it and it was fine. And my committee was ready for it because I went to my committee and said, oh my God, is this going to be a problem? And they said, no, we'll handle it. And we did. But knowing that was really important, right? And in light of that, the other thing I'm going to say is, and this is hard, but know what your standards are, know what the expectations are, and then try to exceed them, right? So for programmatic tenure, I was supposed to go up with 1+, right? So I was supposed to have one article and some other articles. I'm sorry, my dog is now barking in the background. Supposed to have 1+. So I actually went up with 3 articles, right? Because I was going to, and then when we went up for full professor, I had another article plus some other things, right? So I tried to always see what the standards were and then do a little bit better, right? And I think not only does that make sense in terms of our own, to show our own abilities, but again, as legal writing professors, I was gonna be like, if you could do it, I'm gonna do better. And so I thought it was important to at least, to certainly meet the standard. To the extent you can go a little bit beyond the standard, that's helpful. And then my final point is, I think it's really important to show with the teaching what we do, not only in the classroom, but outside the classroom. So I did the same thing. I had one of the chair of my committee actually came in and sat in on my conferences with my students when I met with my conferencing with students and went through the memos. And that wound up going into my reports. And not only did it go into my reports, but he subsequently, as we developed the program about, and I mentioned it, the RNW2 with the different focuses, he's an environmental law professor. He now teaches legal writing. He co-teaches a legal writing class with Lance Long, another legal writing professor who also does environmental law, but he does RNW too. He considers himself now an RNW professor. And this is someone who has been, a podium professor, has taught torts, environmental law for 20 years, and now for the past 5 or 6 years is now teaching legal writing and considers himself a legal writing professor. And I think it's because he saw so much of what we were doing, right? He sat in on the conferences, he came and watched me teach, and that became really important in him understanding what we do and also helped with the tenure package.
Thank you so much, Jason. I want to echo what you said about the co-authored question. I had that issue come up as well because I had co-authored a book and an article, and knowing how your institution is going to give you credit for co-authored works and whether it's encouraged or not, particularly because we're encouraged to do interdisciplinary work, but that in and of itself usually requires co-authoring. And so thinking about what will a book count as 3 articles or 1, and that sort of thing can be really, really helpful. I want to ask just a quick follow-up question to the panelists about scholarship and as it pertains to tenure, because as I was hearing all of your responses, it kind of occurred to me, do you have guidance on whether someone who's planning to go up for tenure or promotion should be strategic in writing certain kinds of pieces of scholarship? So writing a solo piece versus a collaborative piece, or writing in legal writing in your field to show that passion and dedication, or writing something on another area. I think all scholarship involves legal writing. That's always been my opinion. It's all relevant, but I've heard a lot of new professors sort of ask that question, how do I decide what to write if I want to write what I'm interested about, but I also want it to really help me with regard to tenure and promotion. So I wonder if y'all could just kind of quickly share your thoughts on that question. Rosa, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, I think historically, legal writing faculty have just been really careful and, worried, concerned about how their scholarship will be perceived. And justly so, because it really wasn't understood by a lot of podium faculty in terms of what do you mean you're writing about pedagogy, or you're writing about some aspect of teaching. And so that people are doing. So I think it really depends on your particular institution and culture in terms of their perception about scholarship. But I know that it's hard to argue with somebody writing in their field, as you were saying, Mary Beth. And sometimes you go the other way, and then people are like, why aren't you writing about your field, right? So you can never really win. But I think I said this, in response to another question, that I actually like the idea of having my sort of feet in both pools. So, because I'm always really interested in learning and teaching and how we can improve that. But I'm also, interested in international stuff. So I like the idea of having that kind of dual track if you can do that. But again, I think it's very institution specific in terms of perceptions and expectations. By the way, when we did our a tenure scholarship review, we had to have some internal folks review and then external folks, right? I mean, some of the internal folks, felt that they really weren't equipped to evaluate writing about legal writing. So you kind of face that. In a sense, you're educating them, like, wow, this is what scholarship on legal writing looks like. Wow, that's really interesting. And in other cases, they will kind of scoff at it because they don't really consider it, true scholarship. So again, kind of knowing who the sort of the, likely people are who would be reviewing scholarship or trying to influence that lineup, I think can be a good strategic move.
First of all, I want to just piggyback on that question. At Ohio State, we were allowed to nix certain people. So we were allowed to say, please do not ask this person to review my work. And I went farther. There was one person on the promotion and tenure committee, and of course, every candidate got a shepherd from that committee. And there was one person on the committee who had literally announced to his students that they should blow off my class. And so I said, you've got to not have him be my mentor. And when the committee voted whether to send me on to the faculty for promotion, or for tenure rather, he abstained. I roll. Anyway, it is, you got to walk a narrow line as far as what you write about. And Rosa's exactly right. It's going to depend a lot on local culture. I really recommend the Terry Pullman, Linda Edwards work, New Voices in the Legal Academy, to educate yourself and to maybe help you educate faculty about what is legal writing scholarship. And I think it's implicit in that article, and maybe the follow-up that Linda Berger also joined in on. I was going to say all my wonderful emeritus colleagues from UNLV. But somebody should write an explicit article, how to evaluate legal writing scholarship if you've never done it yourself, because this is absolutely a recurring problem that we hear again and again, that we don't think anyone who teaches legal writing on our faculty is good enough to review it. Like this person may have colleagues who teach legal writing, but we don't trust their opinion. So we're going to review it ourselves, but we don't know enough about legal writing to review it. Head throbbing. So, you, like Rosa said, you are going to have to do some educating. I will also just follow up to Jason. I had exactly the number of articles I had to have. I did not have more than that. I had done, my service was out the window because I had all this leadership. So I suppose I had done more there. But don't think that you have to do more than what is required. And I will say, especially if you are, blowing off time giving birth or some crazy thing while you're on the tenure track. Yeah, just because I think one of the things that some faculty fear is that they think that we don't really like to teach legal writing. We're just doing this to get tenure, and then we're going to abandon it. And so by writing about a totally different field, some faculty are like, oh, this shows what she really wants to do. So probably the ideal article is one that is in the sweet spot. It has one foot in legal writing and one foot in something else. When I went up for promotion, I had a ballot design article, so that was part election law, part legal writing. And then my other article was a conspicuous type about use of all caps in documents. So again, it was sort of contract law and legal writing. But of course, we shouldn't have to be just in the perfect sweet spot. So try to really get the bottom line from your faculty mentors. And I think you can legitimately say, I don't want to find out the year I go up that these articles I wrote 3 years ago are not considered appropriate. So I would, when you get that word, I would send an email. Thank you so much for talking to me. I'm so glad to hear that my article on the use of sans serif fonts is considered appropriate for my tenure package, so that you have memorialized it. Yes, and you have an eye toward the future there. So that's my thoughts.
Great, thank you so much. Jason?
Thanks. Yeah, so I agree with what Mary Beth said. You don't have to, kill yourself to exceed standards. I think part of it was because our standards were vague, and I think that was more my point, because it said 1+, and I didn't know what 1+ meant, right? And so, and we even did that for our tenure track, said 2+, and there's always arguments in faculty meetings about what meets 2+, and I'm like, I'm going to avoid all that, right? So if I have 3 articles, no one's going to be able to say I didn't meet 1+ or 2+. So again, I think it just goes to the culture and to knowing what, and reading the rules and reading and knowing what they actually say, and then what is the unwritten rule, right? What says that plus? Is it, our editorials pluses, our perspective or second draft type articles, the plus, right? So, and what happens is we debate that in our tenure meetings, right? Instead of having it defined, right, then it gets debated at the meetings. So again, if you're saying, say you need 3 articles to go for tenure, then you're good, right? 3, boom, you're there. So again, knowing that, I think, and I think this goes back to something we talked about earlier. I think you have to write about what you're passionate. It goes back. I'm going to go full circle and come back to what you're passionate about. And because you're going to be living with it. So, if you find a topic in legal writing that you're passionate about, that you think, wow, this is a really interesting, no one's talked about this, or I have this different spin on, all caps, right? And I think I read Mary Beth's article, but I'm going to go further with it or do something different with it. Then I think you should do that, provided, of course, it's going to be something that the rest of your faculty is going to recognize as a scholarly piece of writing that's going to go to your tenure package. There is a debate, and you will hear it as in the academy, about whether we should be writing in the discipline or not writing in the discipline, and there are people who feel across the spectrum. There are some people who think that as legal writing professors, we should be writing in the discipline and only writing in the discipline. There are others who think, no, as legal writing professors, we can write anything we want and we should write in our interest field. We all come from different backgrounds. And then there's the hybrids that go in the middle. Again, I think you find your niche and do what makes you happy, understanding your culture and what your faculty is going to do. And part of maybe educating. If your faculty is not aware of this discipline that we call legal writing and what legal writing is, talk to some people, right? Get them educated, show them some of the scholarship, or talk about the scholarship and say, hey, I'm going to write in this, this is what I'm going to write. And there's all this other scholarship on this area, but I'm going to take it further or go in this area. And that's what I'm doing. And that's what's going to be part of my tenure package. And you'll either get the thumbs up or maybe the thumbs in the middle, or right, but you can kind of gauge what people are thinking about that.
Jason, a quick follow-up question for you. I believe you said earlier that you did programmatic tenure first and then unitary tenure. Were you able to use the same scholarly pieces for both phases, or did you find that the scholarship requirement changed it? I'm just curious.
Yes, it's a really good question. It didn't change. So we built on it. So it just depended. It depended. And we had people in various places. So people who were already up for programmatic tenure or had programmatic tenure, we were able to use their same scholarship. And again, if they went up with only one piece for their programmatic tenure or the 1+, they had to have a second piece for the unitary tenure, because unitary tenure was 2+. Because I had gone up with 3 pieces, and then I was actually, I was able to use those when I went up for unitary tenure. I never got, well, let me think about this. I did get programmatic tenure, and then I got unitary tenure, right? So I did, but I had another piece at the time, so I did have another piece, and then we actually have another step where you go for full professor. So I had another piece for when I went full professor. So again, overabundance of caution. I was writing anyway because I was writing about things I was interested in. So I was writing. It's part of my job. But yes, when we did the transition, and I was on the committee because I pushed really hard to move us from programmatic tenure to unitary tenure. I was part of the committee that kind of helped write the standard for how we were going to make that switch over. And one of the things that many of my colleagues who already had programmatic tenure were very concerned about was that they weren't going to have to write new articles to go up for unitary tenure. So we did not, that was not a requirement. We were, unless they didn't meet the standard independently for unitary tenure. And there was one who did need to write a second article, which she did to go up to for her unitary to transition from programmatic tenure to unitary tenure. And the other thing we did is we wrote in that you didn't have to move, right? You could stay at programmatic tenure. We highly encouraged, everyone did. So our entire legal writing faculty moved and did move over, which I think is the right choice because you don't want to start having divisions in your status. It was already bad enough that we had divisions with programmatic tenure versus unitary tenure. So it's nice that we're all on one tenure track. And now, of course, we have new hires that are going up and going straight through the process of tenure. Ann Mullins just got her tenure at Stetson on the tenure track, and so we're excited. But it was steps, right? And there was, this goes into the status issues, but there was really steps that we took, really driven by Kirsten Davis, who was the director at the time. We had a directored program, and now we're directorless, which is great. But again, there were very concrete steps that we took to move us from being contract to now unitary tenure.
Jason, I'm going to interrupt you and say Terry Pullman came up with the word autonomous instead of directorless, because directorless sounds too close to directionless.
Yeah, that's good. Right. Right. Yes. Yes.
Just, I think I try to, it's not as easy a word as directorless, unfortunately.
I like autonomous. Well, it's accurate, right? Because we all, like every other professor at Stetson, we are in control of our own destinies, our own classes, our own choices. Yeah. So autonomous is a great word.
Or independent. I don't know. Anyway.